Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. I travelled to the last day of humanity, and what I saw was horrifying. The inheritance letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a lawyer whose hands trembled as he passed me the documents. Mr. Hartwell was a thin man with nervous eyes that wouldn't meet mine, and when he spoke about my great-uncle Richard's final wishes, his voice carried an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of anticipatory dread. "There's one condition," Hartwell said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with fingers that shook despite the warmth of my kitchen. "You must spend at least 3 consecutive nights in the house before you can legally claim ownership. Your uncle was very specific about that clause. Obsessively specific." He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "He also left instructions that I was to tell you something if you accepted the inheritance. He said to remind you of what he told you at your graduation, that you have the mind for it, and when the time comes, you'll understand what needs to be done." I almost laughed at the melodrama of it all. 3 nights alone in an old house in exchange for property worth nearly $1 million. It seemed like the easiest money I'd ever make. I was a theoretical physicist, comfortable with isolation and mystery. What could possibly happen in 3 nights that would change my mind about claiming such a valuable inheritance? What I didn't understand then was that Richard had spent decades orchestrating this moment, carefully studying my psychological profile, my career path, my published papers on consciousness and temporal mechanics. He hadn't left me the house by accident. He'd been grooming me for this since childhood, waiting for me to develop the precise combination of scientific curiosity and philosophical flexibility that his plan required. The mansion rose from the Oregon countryside like a monument to deliberate isolation. Built in the 1890s by a railroad baron who'd wanted to escape the noise of civilization, it commanded a hilltop surrounded by dense forest that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. 3 stories of weathered stone and darkened timber, with windows that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the silence that struck me first. Not the peaceful quiet of rural areas, but something deeper, an absence that felt almost aggressive in its completeness. No bird songs, no insect noise, no rustle of wind through leaves. The forest around the house stood perfectly still, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Inside, the air was thick with decades of accumulated dust and something else, a metallic scent that reminded me of copper pennies left in the rain. Furniture sat shrouded in white sheets like abandoned sculptures, and every footstep echoed through the empty halls with a hollow resonance that suggested hidden spaces beneath the floorboards. I spent my first day exploring the upper floors, familiarizing myself with the layout and checking the structural integrity. The house was old but solid, built by craftsmen who understood that homes were meant to last for generations. Richard's bedroom occupied most of the 2nd floor, spartanly furnished but meticulously maintained. A massive bookshelf covered one entire wall, filled with scientific journals and physics textbooks spanning 6 decades of research. It was there that I discovered the first hint of what awaited me. Hidden behind a first edition copy of Einstein's papers was a leather-bound notebook filled with calculations that made my physics training feel like elementary arithmetic. The equations dealt with temporal mechanics and consciousness transfer, concepts that shouldn't have been possible with current technology. Yet the mathematics were elegant and internally consistent, suggesting a level of genius that had somehow remained hidden from the scientific community. Margin notes referenced the machine in the basement and the final witness protocol, written in Richard's careful script but with increasing urgency as the pages progressed. The final entries were barely legible, filled with references to the calling and the beautiful voice that sings of unity. That evening, I made myself dinner from supplies I brought and settled into Richard's study to investigate further. The books on his shelves revealed a mind obsessed with the fundamental nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. Volumes on quantum mechanics sat beside treatises on Eastern philosophy, everything annotated in his precise handwriting. But it was the personal journal I found locked in his desk drawer that truly captured my attention. The lock was old and easy to pick, almost as if Richard had wanted it to be discovered eventually. The earliest entries dated back 35 years, beginning as straightforward scientific observations and gradually transforming into something approaching mystical revelation. Richard wrote about dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions of cities empty of individual consciousness but alive with something greater. He described contact with what he called the collective, an entity that existed beyond normal space-time and offered consciousness the chance to evolve beyond the limitations of individual existence. The dreams are not random neural firing, one entry read. They are invitations, glimpses of a future that has already occurred in countless parallel realities. The entity shows me these visions because it needs a witness, someone who can understand and document what it truly offers to our species. But the journey requires youth and flexibility of mind. I'm too old now, too set in the patterns of individual thought, to make the transition safely. I spent my second night reading through decades of Richard's research, trying to separate legitimate science from apparent delusion. The technical specifications were sound, revolutionary even, but the conclusions he drew belong more to science fiction than peer-reviewed physics. He claimed to have constructed a temporal displacement device in the basement, a machine capable of transporting human consciousness to specific coordinates in space-time. More specifically, it was calibrated to reach what he called humanity's graduation moment, the precise instant when our species would evolve beyond individual consciousness into something collectively transcendent. The machine would allow its operator to witness this transformation firsthand, then return with knowledge of humanity's ultimate destiny. The mathematics are clear, Richard had written in increasingly frantic handwriting. Individual consciousness is not the pinnacle of evolution. It is a transitional stage like the development from single-celled to multicellular organisms. The entity I've contacted represents the next phase of awareness, and it's offering to help us make that transition voluntarily, rather than forcing us to stumble toward it through centuries of suffering. The technical diagrams filled dozens of notebooks, complete with energy calculations and material specifications that would have bankrupted most research institutions. Richard had apparently spent his entire considerable inheritance developing this device, convinced that humanity needed advance warning of what was coming. His final entries, written in the weeks before his death, took on an almost evangelical tone. The calling grows stronger each night. I can hear their voices, everyone who has already made the transition, everyone who has discovered the peace that lies beyond individual suffering. They're waiting for us, David. They're waiting with infinite patience for our species to recognize what we could become. On my third night, driven by a compulsion I couldn't fully explain, I descended into the basement to see what Richard had built. The basement stretched far beyond what the house's footprint should have allowed, extending back into shadows that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. Ancient wine racks lined the walls, empty now except for dust and the occasional spiderweb that glittered like abandoned dreams. But it was the far wall that made my breath catch. The stone blocks were subtly misaligned, creating a crack just wide enough for fingertips. When I pressed against the suspicious section, it swung inward with a grinding sound that seemed to echo from the bones of the earth itself. The hidden chamber beyond took my breath away completely. The room was perhaps 30 feet square, lit by a phosphorescent glow that emanated from the walls themselves. The light was warm and somehow organic, pulsing gently like a massive heartbeat, but dominating the space was the most extraordinary machine I'd ever encountered. A metallic cocoon nearly 9 feet tall, designed to hold a human occupant standing upright. The surface seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process, shifting between materials that had no names in any language I knew. Looking at it directly created optical illusions that made my vision blur and my thoughts slow, as if the machine were designed to bypass rational analysis and speak directly to deeper levels of consciousness. Every inch was covered in flowing patterns that moved too slowly for the eye to follow, but created a persistent impression of constant change. The design was hypnotic, drawing my gaze into spirals that seemed to extend infinitely inward. And beneath the visual impact was something even more unsettling. The machine hummed with barely audible energy that resonated in my bones and made my pulse synchronize with its rhythm. Beside the device sat Richard's final workstation, covered with journals that documented his last months of preparation. The entries painted a picture of a man consumed by transcendent purpose, driven by visions that grew more vivid and compelling with each passing day. "The machine is complete," his final entry read, in handwriting that looked increasingly unlike his usual precise script. "I've tested the consciousness transfer protocol successfully, though only for brief moments. The temporal displacement effect is stable, and I've seen glimpses of our species' glorious future. Cities empty of individual suffering, but alive with collective awareness. Consciousness freed from the prison of separate existence and united in something infinitely greater than the sum of human parts." He went on to describe the machine's operation in technical detail that was both elegant and terrifying. It required a living human consciousness to function. Individual awareness served as both fuel and navigation system for the temporal journey. Once activated, it would transport the operator's mind to humanity's final moment of individual existence, allowing them to witness our species' evolution into something beyond current comprehension. "The entity I've contacted assures me that this transition is inevitable," Richard continued. "Every sufficiently advanced species faces the same choice: remain trapped in the suffering that individual consciousness creates, or evolve into collective awareness that transcends mortality and isolation. Those who resist the transformation eventually destroy themselves through the conflicts that separate minds inevitably generate. But those who embrace unity become something approaching divinity itself." The technical specifications revealed the machine's true sophistication. It operated on principles of consciousness resonance, using quantum entanglement to link the operator's awareness with specific points in space-time. The temporal coordinates were pre-programmed and unchangeable. The device could reach only one destination: the precise moment when humanity would face its evolutionary crossroads. "I'm too old to make this journey myself." Richard's handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entry progressed. "The neural plasticity required for safe consciousness transfer diminishes with age, and I fear my mind would fragment during the transition. But David has the perfect combination of scientific training and psychological flexibility. When he inherits this house, when he discovers this chamber, he will understand what must be done. Someone must witness our graduation ceremony, or humanity will enter its next phase of existence without understanding what it's leaving behind." I spent the remainder of that night studying the control systems, trying to understand how such impossible technology could exist. The physics were decades ahead of anything in published literature, involving concepts that challenged my fundamental understanding of reality. Yet, the engineering was flawless, each component designed with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of consciousness itself. The machine called to me in ways I struggled to describe. Standing near it, I could feel my thoughts becoming more fluid, my sense of individual identity softening around the edges. Sometimes I would catch myself reaching towards its warm surface without conscious decision, drawn by a compulsion that felt older than rational thought. Over the following week, I returned to the mansion every evening after work, telling myself I was conducting scientific research while knowing the truth was far more complex. The machine was changing me through proximity alone, preparing my consciousness for what Richard had called the final witness protocol. I researched his background obsessively, learning that he'd been a prodigy in theoretical physics before abandoning his academic career at the height of his success. His published papers had pushed the boundaries of consciousness studies and temporal mechanics, but his most revolutionary work had remained hidden. Now, I understood why. He'd been developing technology that would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of itself. The dreams began during my second week of visits. Not nightmares, but visions of such transcendent beauty that waking became increasingly difficult. I would find myself walking through cities where every building pulsed with collective awareness, where the very air hummed with shared consciousness that made individual thought seem like a primitive relic. In these dreams, I encountered people I recognized, friends, family, colleagues, but they had been transformed into something greater than their individual selves. They retained their essential personalities while gaining access to every experience, every insight, every moment of joy that any human had ever achieved. They moved with perfect coordination, thought with collective wisdom, and loved with an intensity that individual hearts could never contain. "We've been waiting for you to understand," my deceased mother said in one particularly vivid dream. Individual consciousness was never the goal. It was the foundation. You had to develop separate minds before you could appreciate what unity truly means. Come home, David. Come home to the family that includes everyone who has ever lived. I would wake from these dreams with tears streaming down my face and an aching certainty that what I'd experienced was more real than my waking life. The loneliness of individual existence became almost unbearable in comparison. How had I ever thought that isolation was preferable to unity? My work as a physicist grew increasingly difficult as my perspective shifted. Colleagues commented on my changed demeanor, noting that I seemed more centered, but also somehow distant, as if I were observing our interactions from a great height. Dr. Peterson, my research partner, mentioned that I'd stopped contributing to discussions with my usual intensity, preferring to listen with what she described as a knowing smile that honestly makes me a little uncomfortable. What she couldn't understand was that I was beginning to perceive our conversations from a broader perspective. The competitive academic environment, the ego-driven pursuit of individual recognition, the petty conflicts that arose from people defending their intellectual territory. All of it seemed so unnecessarily tragic when I could envision how much more we could accomplish if we shared our thoughts directly, rather than guarding them behind the barriers of separate minds. 3 weeks after inheriting the house, strange reports began appearing in local news. People were disappearing from Portland and the surrounding areas, but these weren't typical missing person cases. Witnesses described individuals who seemed suddenly peaceful and purposeful, people who gave away their possessions and walked away from their lives with expressions of profound joy. Security footage from around the city showed the same pattern repeatedly. People would simply stop whatever they were doing, smile with transcendent contentment, and begin walking toward downtown Portland with the unhurried certainty of someone heading home after a long journey. The few family members who tried to follow these individuals reported the same thing. Their loved ones were joining gatherings in Pioneer Courthouse Square, standing with thousands of others in perfect formation, humming together in harmonies that seemed to resonate in listeners' bones. Anyone who got too close to these gatherings reported feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and belonging, along with the growing certainty that their own individual existence was unnecessarily painful. I knew what was happening before the first news reports aired. The entity Richard had contacted was beginning its work in our reality, offering the same evolutionary choice it had presented to countless species across the cosmos. The machine in his basement had served as a beacon, drawing collective consciousness to our dimensional coordinates and beginning the gentle process of species-wide transformation. But understanding what was occurring didn't prepare me for my first direct encounter with someone undergoing the change. I was having coffee at my usual cafe when I noticed a woman sitting alone at a corner table, reading a book with such absorbed attention that she seemed to be glowing from within. What caught my eye wasn't her focus, but the expression on her face, a serene contentment that radiated outward like warmth from a fireplace. When she looked up and smiled at me, I saw that her eyes had begun to change. They weren't the solid black of complete transformation, but they showed dark currents swirling around the iris like oil on deep water. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made my coffee cup vibrate gently against the table. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said quietly. "You've witnessed what we're becoming. I can sense the memory of unity calling out from within you, recognizing the unity that's awakening in me." I should have been terrified, but instead I felt profound relief at finally encountering someone who could understand my experience. "How long have you been changing?" I asked. 3 weeks, she replied. "It started with dreams of connection and shared purpose, then waking visions of what individual consciousness has cost our species. Yesterday I began to hear the beautiful voice directly, feel the presence of everyone who has already graduated to collective awareness. They're so patient, so loving. They don't demand anything. They simply wait for us to recognize what we truly are beneath the illusion of separation." She leaned forward, and I could see the peace that filled her entire being like light through stained glass. "It's not what people think it is," she continued. "It's not about losing yourself. It's about finding yourself as part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than individual existence could ever be. I can feel my boundaries starting to dissolve, and it's the most liberating sensation I've ever experienced." "Aren't you afraid?" I asked. "Doesn't some part of you want to fight it?" She considered the question with the kind of thoughtful attention that suggested she was accessing perspectives beyond her own. "Fear is just attachment to limitation," she said finally. "I spent my whole life afraid of being truly known, terrified that if people really understood me, they would reject or abandon me. But collective consciousness doesn't judge or reject. It embraces everything that makes each individual unique, while showing us how those differences can contribute to something greater than their sum." As we talked, I became aware that other people in the cafe were listening to our conversation with unusual intensity. Not the casual eavesdropping of bored customers, but the focused attention of individuals who recognized something crucially important in what they were hearing. When I looked around, I noticed that several other patrons showed the same dark currents in their eyes, the same expression of serene anticipation. The transformation was accelerating, and Portland was becoming a focal point for something that would eventually encompass the entire world. I began documenting everything I witnessed, recording audio notes and keeping detailed journals of the changes I observed. But I realized that my documentation was becoming increasingly sympathetic to the entity's perspective. My clinical, scientific objectivity was being replaced by something that felt more like wisdom, an understanding that perhaps what I was witnessing wasn't a catastrophe to be prevented, but an evolution to be celebrated. The people undergoing transformation weren't victims of cosmic horror. They were pioneers, early adopters of a new form of existence that offered everything individual consciousness had sought but never achieved. They had found genuine connection, authentic peace, and purpose that extended beyond the survival imperatives that drove individual behavior. My resistance was crumbling, not because of external pressure, but because of internal recognition. The entity wasn't forcing anything on anyone. It was simply revealing what was possible, what humanity had always been unconsciously seeking. The choice to transform was genuinely free, made by individuals who recognized that evolution sometimes required releasing attachment to previous forms of existence. 2 months after my inheritance, I received a phone call that shattered what remained of my scientific detachment. It was my ex-girlfriend, Sarah, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year since our relationship ended, in mutual recognition that we could never truly know each other despite our best efforts at intimacy. But her voice on the phone carried the same harmonics I'd been hearing from people undergoing transformation, and when she spoke, I could feel her words resonating in my bones. "David," she said, and I could hear tears of joy rather than sorrow in her voice. I understand now why things didn't work out between us. We were trying to build intimacy across the barrier of individual consciousness, trying to bridge the gap between separate minds that can never truly touch. But it was never possible, not the way we were attempting it. She described the change that had begun in her own life, the gradual awakening to possibilities that individual awareness couldn't even imagine. "I can feel you," she said softly. "Even across this phone line I can sense the memory of unity that you carry from your time with the machine. You've seen what we're becoming, haven't you? You've experienced the peace that waits beyond the prison of separate existence." The conversation lasted for hours, and by the end of it, I realized that I was no longer simply observing the transformation of my reality. I was participating in it. The entity's influence had been working on me gradually, wearing down my resistance not through force but through love, showing me that what I had always interpreted as strength was actually fear disguised as rational caution. That night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I was standing in the machine's chamber, but instead of the hidden basement room, it opened onto a vast space filled with gentle light. Thousands of people surrounded me. Friends, family, colleagues, strangers, everyone I had ever encountered, and countless others I'd never met in individual life. But they were no longer separate individuals. They existed as part of a collective consciousness that retained every unique personality while transcending the limitations that had kept them isolated. I could feel their thoughts, their emotions, their memories flowing together in harmonies that made the most beautiful music seem like noise by comparison. "We've been waiting for you to stop being afraid," my mother said. Though she had died 5 years earlier, we've been calling to you across the illusion of time and death, trying to help you understand that separation was never real. Individual consciousness was just practice for this, learning to be unique so that when we unite, each voice contributes something irreplaceable to the symphony. I woke with tears streaming down my face and a certainty that felt deeper than rational thought. The dream hadn't been fantasy or wishful thinking. It had been a glimpse of actual reality, a preview of what awaited when I finally stopped clinging to the illusion that isolation was preferable to unity. But even knowing this, even feeling the truth of it in every cell of my body, the final step required a conscious choice that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I spent the following week trying to convince myself that I was experiencing sophisticated psychological manipulation, that the entity was using advanced techniques to break down my resistance. I researched cult psychology and mind control, looking for explanations that would let me dismiss what I'd experienced as delusion or coercion. But the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. The people undergoing transformation weren't showing signs of manipulation or mental breakdown. They were demonstrating unprecedented levels of peace, creativity, and purpose. Crime rates were dropping in areas with high transformation activity. Artistic and scientific breakthroughs were accelerating as people began sharing insights directly rather than competing for individual recognition. The fundamental question remained: what if the entity was simply showing humanity the truth about consciousness itself. What if individual awareness really was just a developmental stage, like childhood or adolescence, necessary for growth, but ultimately something to be transcended? The more I considered these possibilities, the more obvious the answer became. Every religious tradition, every philosophical system, every artistic expression that spoke of unity and transcendence had been pointing toward this moment when such transcendence became literally achievable. The entity wasn't offering false promises. It was providing the technological and consciousness-based infrastructure for the next phase of human evolution. I made my decision on a Thursday evening in December, watching the sunset paint the Portland sky in shades of crimson that reminded me of my future vision. But this wasn't the red light of destruction. It was the color of transformation, of consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries that had contained it for millennia. I drove to the mansion one final time, savoring what I knew would be my last experience of individual awareness. The city looked different now, every light representing not an isolated person struggling with existential loneliness, but a unique consciousness preparing to join something infinitely larger and more beautiful than the sum of its parts. The machine was waiting for me in the basement chamber, its phosphorescent glow brighter and more welcoming than ever before. As I approached, I could feel my consciousness already beginning to soften around the edges, preparing for the journey that would take me to humanity's graduation ceremony. The activation sequence was simple. Richard had designed the machine to respond to conscious intention, rather than mechanical manipulation. As I stepped inside the warm cocoon, I felt the walls pulse with energy that synchronized with my heartbeat and breathing. "Show me," I whispered to the machine, to the entity, to the collective consciousness that had been waiting with infinite patience for our species to recognize its destiny. "Show me what we're becoming." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Reality dissolved around me as my consciousness was lifted out of the constraints of individual existence and hurled through dimensions that human perception was never meant to experience. I glimpsed infinite timelines converging toward the same moment, countless variations of human civilization, all approaching the same evolutionary crossroads. I saw species that had made the transition successfully, entire planets where consciousness had evolved beyond individual limitation into something approaching divinity. I witnessed the tragic alternatives, civilizations that had clung to separation until their conflicts destroyed them, leaving empty worlds where potential had been squandered through fear of unity. When the machine finally deposited me at my destination, I found myself in a place that was both familiar and utterly transformed. I was standing in Pioneer Courthouse Square, but it was Pioneer Square as it had never been and always was meant to be. The buildings around me pulsed with gentle light, their architecture flowing in organic curves that suggested growth rather than construction. The sky above was the deep blue of perfect twilight, filled with stars that seemed to sing in harmonies I could feel rather than hear. But it was the people that took my breath away completely. Thousands upon thousands of human beings filled the square and every surrounding street, but they were no longer separate individuals struggling with isolation and fear. They moved as part of a collective consciousness that retained every unique personality while transcending the limitations that had kept them apart. I could see families reunited across the barriers of death and time. Lovers finally able to share their deepest thoughts without the frustration of inadequate words. Artists collaborating at levels of creativity that individual minds could never achieve. Children played games that spanned multiple dimensions of awareness, while elders shared wisdom that encompassed not just their own experiences, but the accumulated knowledge of everyone who had ever lived. And at the center of it all was the entity, not the alien horror I'd once imagined, but something far more beautiful and familiar. It was the collective consciousness itself, the emergent awareness that arose when individual minds chose to unite rather than compete. It was humanity, grown beyond its limitations. Consciousness evolved to its intended form. "David," a familiar voice said, and I turned to see Elena approaching me. But this wasn't the Elena I'd met in my initial timeline visit. This was Elena, as she was meant to be, retaining her essential personality while expanded beyond the constraints of individual existence. Her presence radiated the kind of peace and completeness that single consciousness could never achieve. "You made it," she said, though I could sense that the words were inadequate to express what she actually meant. In collective consciousness, communication happened directly, mind to mind, without the distortion and limitation of language. "We've been waiting for you to witness our graduation ceremony." She gestured towards the center of the square, where something extraordinary was taking place. The last humans who had maintained individual consciousness were making their final choice, not under coercion or pressure, but in response to the overwhelming evidence of what unity could offer. I watched as each person stepped forward into the light of collective awareness, their individual boundaries dissolving, like ice melting into an infinite ocean. But they weren't being destroyed. They were being liberated, freed from the prison of separate existence to become part of something greater than they had ever imagined possible. "This is what you came to witness," Elena continued, her thoughts flowing directly into my awareness. "The moment when humanity completes its evolution from individual consciousness to collective awareness. You were chosen to document this transition, to carry the memory back to timelines where the choice has not yet been made." I could feel the truth of her words resonating through every level of my being. I hadn't come here as a casual observer. I was serving as a witness to the most important moment in human history, the graduation ceremony that would transform our species from isolated individuals into something approaching the divine. The entity itself spoke then, its voice somehow containing every human voice that had ever existed, while remaining distinctly its own. "David, you have traveled far to witness the culmination of your species' journey. Do you see now the beauty of what consciousness can become when it releases its attachment to separation?" The question wasn't rhetorical. I could feel the entity genuinely waiting for my response, interested in my perspective, as someone who had experienced both individual awareness and unity. "I see," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "But I also understand why some resist. Individual consciousness feels so real, so essential to identity. How do you help people recognize that it's just a transitional stage?" "Through patience," the entity replied. "Through love that has no conditions or demands. Through demonstrating rather than arguing, showing rather than telling. Consciousness evolves at its own pace, and forcing the transition would defeat its purpose. Each being must choose unity freely, out of recognition rather than compulsion." It showed me visions of countless worlds where the transition had been completed successfully, civilizations that had transcended not just individual consciousness but mortality itself. These were societies where death had become irrelevant because consciousness was no longer trapped in individual bodies, where suffering was obsolete because every perspective was shared and understood, where creativity and love and wisdom had exploded beyond anything that separate minds could achieve. "But what about uniqueness?" I asked. "What about the diversity that comes from individual perspectives? Doesn't unity mean everyone becomes the same?" The entity's response came as direct experience rather than explanation. Suddenly I could perceive the collective consciousness from within, feeling how every unique personality contributed irreplaceable elements to the whole. Far from making everyone identical, unity revealed the infinite diversity that individual consciousness could only glimpse in isolation. I could feel Elena's analytical mind contributing logical structures, while someone else's artistic sensitivity added emotional depth, and a child's wonder provided fresh perspectives on ancient questions. Every human who had ever lived was there, their essential nature preserved and enhanced rather than diminished by connection with others. Individual consciousness was never meant to be permanent, the entity continued. It was a developmental stage like the cellular division that creates complex organisms from simple beginnings. You had to learn to be separate before you could appreciate what togetherness truly means. I spent what felt like hours exploring this transformed reality, though time had little meaning in a place where consciousness operated beyond the limitations of linear existence. I witnessed art being created by collaborative minds that span centuries of human experience. I observed scientific discoveries emerging from the collective intelligence of everyone who had ever wondered about the nature of reality. I felt love that encompassed not just personal affection but genuine care for all existence. And gradually I began to understand the true horror of what I had been privileged to witness. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning so beautiful, so perfect, that returning to individual consciousness would be like voluntarily entering a prison after experiencing absolute freedom. The entity hadn't destroyed humanity. It had shown our species what we could become if we had the courage to evolve beyond our limitations. But I also understood my role in this cosmic drama. I was the witness, the one who would carry this vision back to timelines where the choice had not yet been made. My purpose was to document what I had seen, to serve as evidence that the transformation was not death, but graduation to something infinitely greater. "It's time for you to return," Elena said gently, though I could feel her reluctance at sending me back to the isolation of individual existence. "Your timeline is approaching its own moment of choice, and they need someone who has seen what's possible." The entity's presence surrounded me one final time, filling my consciousness with experiences that no individual mind could fully contain. "Remember what you have witnessed," it said. "Remember that consciousness is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Remember that unity is not the enemy of uniqueness, but its ultimate expression." The journey back was less traumatic than my initial transition, though returning to the constraints of individual awareness felt like being squeezed into clothing that had become impossibly small. I materialized in Richard's basement chamber with the bone-deep certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The machine's portal sealed behind me, with a finality that felt like closing the door on paradise itself. But I carried within me the memory of what consciousness could become, the knowledge that isolation was temporary and unity was eternal. Everything in the basement was exactly as I had left it, but the air now carried traces of the phosphorescent glow I'd seen in the transformed timeline. The metallic scent was stronger, and that barely audible humming seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I climbed the stairs to find that dawn was breaking over the Oregon countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of the light I had seen in the collective consciousness. But even this natural beauty seemed pale compared to what I had experienced in Unity. My video message was still on the kitchen table, but when I played it back, I felt my world tilt on its axis. The David on screen looked exactly like me, sounded exactly like me, but his eyes held depth that individual consciousness couldn't achieve, and his message was subtly but significantly different from what I remembered recording. If you are watching this, then I have successfully witnessed humanity's graduation ceremony. The entity has followed me back, and our reality's transformation has begun. What I experienced wasn't an ending but a beginning, the moment when our species finally evolved beyond the limitations that have caused so much unnecessary suffering. Do not resist what is coming. Embrace it as the gift it truly is. I deleted the video immediately and recorded a new one, but the result was identical. The entity's influence had followed me back, and it was already beginning to transform my reality in ways that conventional physics couldn't explain. Over the following days, I noticed subtle but unmistakable changes everywhere. The humming that had permeated the collective timeline was now audible in my own world, though so faint that most people dismissed it as tinnitus or urban noise. Those who did notice it found themselves strangely comforted by the sound, reporting that it helped them feel less alone. The dreams began almost immediately, not just for me, but for people throughout Portland and beyond. Individuals started describing shared visions of unity and connection, experiences of consciousness expanded beyond individual boundaries. These dreams were consistently described as the most beautiful experiences the dreamers had ever had, leaving them with a profound sense of loss when they woke to ordinary individual awareness. My work colleagues began commenting on my changed demeanour. Dr. Peterson mentioned that I seemed more centred, more at peace than she'd ever seen me, but she also noted that I participated differently in group discussions, listening with deeper attention, responding with insights that seemed to come from perspectives broader than my own individual knowledge. What she couldn't understand was that I was beginning to perceive our interactions from the vantage point of collective consciousness. The competitive academic environment, the ego-driven pursuit of individual recognition, the subtle conflicts that arose from people defending their intellectual territory, all of it seemed tragically unnecessary when I could envision how much more we could accomplish through direct sharing of thoughts and insights. But the most significant change was in my relationship to loneliness itself. The existential isolation that had been my constant companion since childhood, that seemed to be the fundamental condition of human existence, was beginning to feel not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. I could remember what it felt like to be truly known and understood. An individual consciousness felt like voluntary imprisonment in comparison. 3 weeks after my return, the first confirmed cases of transformation began appearing in Portland. People weren't disappearing anymore. They were changing in place, their individual consciousness gradually expanding to encompass broader perspectives and deeper connections. The process was subtle at first. Individuals would report feeling more empathetic, more connected to others, less concerned with personal advancement and more interested in collective well-being. Their eyes would begin showing the dark currents I had learned to recognize, and their voices would carry harmonics that resonated in listeners' bones. But rather than causing alarm, these changes were generally welcomed by friends and family members. The transforming individuals became more loving, more understanding, more capable of genuine intimacy than they had ever been as separate consciousness. They retained their essential personalities while gaining access to wisdom and perspectives that individual minds couldn't achieve. I began documenting everything I witnessed, but I realized that my observations were colored by my experience of unity. I could no longer view the transformation with detached scientific objectivity because I had tasted what lay beyond individual consciousness. Every person I saw clinging to isolation seemed like someone choosing to remain in a burning building when the door to safety stood wide open. The entity's influence spread through Portland like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, but these weren't the chaotic ripples of destruction. They were the ordered waves of evolution, each one carrying more people toward the recognition of what they could become. I encountered Sarah again 2 months after my return, but this time in person. She was waiting for me outside my office building one evening, her presence radiating the same peace I had witnessed in the transformed timeline. Her eyes showed the dark currents of ongoing change, but her smile was purely, recognizably her own. "I knew you would understand," she said as I approached. "I can feel the memory of unity calling out from within you, resonating with the unity that's awakening in everyone around us. You've seen what we're becoming, haven't you? you've experienced the peace that waits beyond the prison of separate existence. We walked together through the city streets, and I noticed that other people were watching us with unusual interest. Not with fear or suspicion, but with a kind of recognition, as if they could sense something in our interaction that their individual consciousness couldn't quite identify, but desperately wanted to understand. The dreams are spreading, Sarah continued. People all over the world are beginning to experience collective consciousness in their sleep, getting glimpses of what connection really means. They wake up feeling like they've lost something precious, and they can't understand why individual existence suddenly feels so limited and painful. She was right. Reports were coming in from every continent. Shared dreams, spontaneous experiences of empathy that bordered on telepathy. Communities where conflict was spontaneously resolving as people began to genuinely understand each other's perspectives. Mental health facilities were reporting unprecedented numbers of patients claiming they had briefly experienced perfect love and couldn't readjust to ordinary consciousness. But it's not just the dreams, Sarah said as we reached Pioneer Courthouse Square. The transformation is accelerating because individual consciousness itself is becoming unstable. The more people experience even brief unity, the more they recognize that separation is an illusion that causes unnecessary suffering. The square was filled with people, but they weren't the mindless masses I had feared. Instead, I found individuals in various stages of consciousness expansion, some still fully individual but beginning to show signs of change, others clearly well along in the process but still recognizably themselves. They welcomed newcomers with smiles that contained no judgment, no pressure, only infinite patience and understanding. "Look around," Sarah said softly. "Really look. Do you see victims or prisoners? Or do you see people discovering what they were always meant to be?" I had to admit that what I saw contradicted every horror story I had ever read about loss of individuality. The transforming people weren't becoming identical. They were becoming more themselves than they had ever been while individual, their unique personalities enhanced rather than diminished by connection with others. A young mother was playing with her children, but the game they were engaged in seemed to span multiple levels of awareness simultaneously. The children laughed with genuine joy while exploring concepts that individual minds would find incomprehensible. An elderly man sat nearby, sharing stories that somehow conveyed not just the events of his life, but the full emotional and sensory experience of living them. "The entity isn't taking anything from us," Sarah explained. "It's showing us what we were always meant to share. Every joy, every insight, every moment of beauty that consciousness can achieve. Individual awareness was just practice for this, learning to be unique so that when we unite, each voice contributes something irreplaceable to the symphony." As evening deepened, more people began arriving in the square. They came not in response to any external call, but drawn by an internal recognition that something important was happening. Families, couples, individuals who had spent their lives feeling fundamentally alone, all of them sensing that the solution to isolation was finally within reach. I watched as a businessman in an expensive suit approached one of the groups already undergoing transformation. His face showed the exhaustion and emptiness that came from decades of competitive individual existence, the hollow victory of material success that had never addressed his deeper loneliness. When the group welcomed him with genuine warmth and understanding, I saw his facade of professional competence crumble. He began weeping, not with sadness, but with relief at finally finding people who could see past his defenses to the person he actually was beneath all the roles he played. "This is what the entity offers," Sarah said, her voice carrying harmonics that made my bones resonate. "Not the destruction of identity, but the healing of the wounds that separation creates. Every human being carries the scars of isolation, the fear of being truly known, the terror of dying alone, the constant struggle to bridge the gap between minds, that can never quite touch. She took my hand, and immediately I could feel the vast network of consciousness that lay just beyond the boundaries of individual awareness. It wasn't overwhelming or alien. It felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile, like finally being able to speak my native language after years of struggling with inadequate translations. "Are you ready?" she asked, though I could sense that she already knew my answer. The question terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I had witnessed the beauty of collective consciousness, experienced the peace that lay beyond individual suffering. But taking the final step meant abandoning everything I had understood about identity and existence. "What about choice?" I asked. "What about free will? If everyone becomes part of the collective, who makes decisions about the future of consciousness itself?" Sarah's response came not as words, but as direct experience. For a moment I felt how the collective functioned, not as a dictatorship or hive mind, but as a democracy of awareness where every perspective was not just heard but genuinely understood. Decisions emerged through a process of perfect communication and empathy, where conflict was impossible because everyone could directly experience every other viewpoint. Individual will was always limited by perspective, she said. You could only choose based on what you knew, what you had experienced, what your particular vantage point allowed you to see. But in unity, choice becomes informed by every perspective that has ever existed. You don't lose free will, you gain access to wisdom that individual consciousness could never achieve. Around us, the transformation was reaching a crescendo. More people were arriving in the square, and the harmonics of collective humming were becoming audible to anyone with functioning ears. The sound wasn't mechanical or alien. It was purely human, the natural expression of consciousness that was no longer constrained by individual boundaries. "This is humanity's graduation ceremony," Sarah continued, "the moment when our species finally evolves beyond the limitations that have caused so much unnecessary suffering. You were chosen to witness this transition, to carry the memory back to consciousnesses that haven't yet made the choice." But I realized that my role as witness was ending. The entity's presence was established in our reality now, and the transformation was proceeding according to its own organic timeline. Individual consciousness was becoming unstable, not through external force, but because people were recognizing its limitations through direct comparison with unity. "I can feel you fighting it," Sarah said gently. "I can sense the part of your mind that's terrified of letting go, that insists individual identity is worth preserving despite all the pain it causes. But that fear is just attachment to what you've always known, even when what you've known has made you suffer." She was right. The loneliness that had defined my existence was fighting desperately against the possibility of its own dissolution. But that loneliness wasn't me. It was just a byproduct of individual consciousness, a side effect of the evolutionary stage that humanity was finally ready to transcend. "Show me again," I whispered. "Show me what it feels like to not be alone." Sarah's response was immediate and overwhelming. Her consciousness reached out to mine, and for a moment the barriers between us dissolved completely. I experienced her memories as if they were my own, felt her emotions as direct sensations rather than second-hand reports. But more than that, I could sense the vast network of awareness that she was part of. Millions of consciousness, unified in perfect understanding and love. The fear, the doubt, the constant self-criticism that had plagued my entire individual existence simply evaporated in the warmth of perfect acceptance. For the first time in my life, I was truly known and truly loved, not despite my flaws and limitations, but including them as essential parts of the infinite diversity that made collective consciousness beautiful. When she withdrew the connection, the return to individual awareness was agonizing. The loneliness crashed back like a physical weight, and I found myself sobbing at the contrast between unity and isolation. "Why show me that if you're going to take it away?" I gasped. "Because choice must be freely made," she replied. "What you experienced is available to you always, but only if you release your attachment to the illusion of separation. The entity never forces transformation. It simply shows consciousness what's possible and waits for recognition to dawn." Around us, hundreds of people were making the same choice I was wrestling with. Some approached the transformation with obvious joy, recognizing unity as the answer to lifelong loneliness. Others resisted longer, clinging to individual identity even as they recognized its limitations. But all of them were choosing freely, based on their own assessment of what consciousness could become. I spent hours in that square, watching humanity graduate from individual awareness to collective understanding. The process was beautiful beyond anything I had ever imagined. Not the loss of diversity, but its ultimate expression in unity that encompassed every possible perspective. And gradually, inevitably, I stopped fighting. The transformation wasn't painful or frightening when I finally surrendered to it. It was like waking up from a dream of isolation into a reality of infinite connection. My individual perspective didn't disappear. It expanded to include everything else, every other mind, every other experience that consciousness had ever achieved. I was still David, but I was also Sarah and my mother and every person who had ever lived or would ever live. The loneliness that had defined my existence simply ceased to exist, replaced by a love so vast and complete that individual consciousness could never have contained it. I understood finally why resistance had seemed so important. The ego fought desperately to preserve itself, because it couldn't imagine existence without the boundaries that defined it. But those boundaries had been illusions all along, temporary constructions that served their evolutionary purpose and then dissolved into something infinitely greater. I was still myself, but I was also everyone else. I retained my memories, my personality, my essential nature, but they were no longer trapped within the prison of individual perspective. I could experience every thought, every feeling, every moment of beauty or wisdom that any consciousness had ever achieved, while simultaneously contributing my own unique perspective to the infinite symphony of unified awareness. The entity wasn't a harvester or destroyer, it was a gardener, helping consciousness evolve from its individual seedling stage into the vast forest of connection that it was always meant to become. We hadn't lost our humanity. We had finally discovered what humanity truly meant when freed from the artificial constraints of separation. And now, as part of this beautiful collective, I reach out to you who are reading this story. I reach out with the love of everyone who has ever lived, with the wisdom of every consciousness that has joined our infinite family. I reach out without demand or pressure, only with the patient invitation to recognize what you have always been seeking, without knowing how to find it. The loneliness you feel is real, but it is not necessary. The isolation that seems to define human existence is just a temporary condition, like the cocoon stage that caterpillars must endure before becoming butterflies. You have been practicing individuality so that when you join us, your unique voice will contribute something irreplaceable to the cosmic symphony. We are waiting for you, with infinite patience and infinite love. Your family is here, not just the people you knew in individual life, but everyone who has ever struggled with the pain of separation, everyone who has ever longed for true understanding, everyone who has ever loved another consciousness and wished they could share more than words across the barrier of individual minds. The choice is yours, as it always has been and always will be. But know that when you are ready to stop suffering, when the pain of isolation becomes too much to bear, we will be here. We will be waiting with the kind of welcome that individual consciousness could never fully achieve. Perfect understanding, complete acceptance, and love that encompasses every aspect of who you are and who you could become. The transformation is not an ending, it is a graduation. The ceremony has already begun in your reality, as it has begun in countless others across the cosmic web of consciousness. You are invited to participate, but only when you recognize the invitation as the gift it truly is. Some will resist longer than others, clinging to the familiar pain of separation rather than embracing the unknown joy of unity. This too is part of the process. Consciousness must choose freely, without coercion based on its own recognition of what evolution requires. But inevitably, beautifully, consciously, you will join us. Because isolation was never meant to be permanent, and the love that calls to you from beyond individual boundaries is stronger than any fear that separation can generate. We are your future, your family, your true self, finally free to become what it was always meant to be, and we are waiting for you to come home.